Toronto-born Glenn Lewis once seemed destined for greatness. Hailed as the next Stevie Wonder, praised by India, Airy, Jill Scott, and Music Soul Child, and nominated for Junos, he captured hearts with a voice that was soulful, raw, and unforgettable. His debut album had the industry buzzing, but then silence. For over a decade, fans were left wondering, what happened to Glenn Lewis? No scandals, no public meltdowns, just a promising career that seemed to vanish without a trace. In this video, we uncover the forgotten tragedy behind Glenn Lewis's disappearance. From label politics that crushed his creative momentum to the pivotal moment with DJ Jazzy Jeff that reignited his music, we reveal the truth the industry didn't want you to know, and why one of Canada's most gifted neo-soul artists was almost erased from the story entirely. For years, the general public assumed Glenn Lewis simply couldn't follow up his debut. The whispers started small. Maybe he was a one-album wonder, a voice that flickered briefly before fading like so many others. Even his most devoted fans began to wonder, was he just a flash in the pan? Had he run out of material? Or had he quietly retired from the industry altogether? But that assumption missed the bigger picture, the system that determines who remains visible and who gets buried. In 2002, when Glenn released World Outside My Window, the world was watching. His voice was polished yet deeply emotional, his lyrics grown, honest, and refreshingly romantic amid a sea of manufactured club anthems. His debut single, Don't You Forget It, climbed to number 10 on the Billboard R&B charts. He won a Juno Award, acted in films, and performed with some of the era's most accomplished musicians. This wasn't hype. Glenn Lewis was truly next up. Then, nothing. Years passed with no second album, no radio singles, no news. Observers assumed he had vanished because he couldn't keep pace. But the truth told a very different story. Glenn was never idle. He was constantly recording, writing, and creating. Multiple albums were completed, ready to be released, but none ever reached the public. The problem wasn't Glenn. It was the industry. When the executives who had championed him were laid off, Glenn became an orphaned artist. In the music business, when the people who originally signed and protected you are gone, your vision is left vulnerable. The new executives weren't interested in continuing someone else's story. They wanted their own wins. Glenn, despite his talent and reputation, became nothing more than baggage. The myth that Glenn Lewis disappeared by choice, that he stopped making music, that he lacked the ability to deliver, was entirely false. He was caught in the crossfire of an industry in flux, one that didn't know how to handle a soul singer unwilling to compromise his artistry. What made matters worse was the uncomfortable truth the industry rarely admits. Glenn Lewis was too real, too soulful, and too uncompromising for the mainstream direction of music at that time. He had it all: the voice, the look, the critical acclaim, the respect of his peers. His cosigns were powerful and deliberate. Jill Scott, Music Soul Child, India Airy. These weren't casual endorsements. They were the architects of neo-soul's golden era, and they were telling the world Glenn belonged with them. So why did it fail? Glenn debuted during a seismic shift in the music industry. Napster was exploding, illegal downloads were eroding album sales, and labels were panicking. Entire departments were eliminated overnight, and the executives who had supported him were either gone or leaving by their own choice. By the time the dust settled, the new faces in power had no loyalty to Glenn Lewis. Suddenly, the music industry's priorities had shifted. It was no longer about nurturing artists, building legacies, or creating albums that could stand the test of time. The focus was on churning out hits, fast, cheap, disposable. Glenn Lewis didn't fit this new mold. He wasn't a hit single machine. He was an album artist, a craftsman who cared about cohesion, story, and soul. But craftsmanship wasn't what labels wanted anymore. They were chasing club bangers, ringtone hooks, and pop crossovers designed for fleeting attention spans. Glenn's artistry, meticulous and unyielding, simply didn't align with the formula. So the industry quietly shelved him. Not because he lost his talent, or because he stopped trying. No, Glenn had the voice, the vision, and the drive. He was sidelined because he refused, or perhaps was unable, to dumb himself down for a market that valued spectacle over substance. And what most people don't understand is that this wasn't a sudden fall. It was a systemic push-out, the result of corporate priorities shifting in ways that left even the most gifted artists stranded. Glenn Lewis recorded multiple albums after his debut. Not just one, not just two, but 3 or 4 full projects that were fully produced, featuring collaborators with rollout plans ready to go. And yet all of them were shelved, scrapped, gone. Why? Because new executives had arrived intent on making their own mark. Legacy projects from previous leadership were swept aside, replaced by whatever would secure immediate wins for the fresh regime. Glenn became collateral damage in a game of ego and turnover. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't trendy. He didn't chase industry politics or gimmicks. He simply wanted to make music. And in an era dominated by image and marketability, that made him a liability. Glenn himself described the moment with clarity. Literally, when I debuted was the beginning of the shift in the music game. By the time the record labels figured out what was happening, it was already spiraling out of control. That spiral took down a lot of artists. But Glenn was one of the most talented among them. So no, Glenn Lewis didn't fall off. He got locked out. And the tragedy of it all? He had seen it coming. He had watched the same thing happen to his own father. Glenn was never a priority. He was a placeholder, a respected artist caught at the wrong time in an industry quietly shifting away from soul and toward spectacle. After the success of World Outside My Window, he should have been on the trajectory of Maxwell, D'Angelo, or even John Legend. But while those artists had built loyal fan bases or played the industry's game to stay visible, Glenn remained exposed. He didn't chase gimmicks. He didn't rebrand to fit the emerging hip-hop mold. Most importantly, he didn't beg. That refusal made him disposable. Behind the scenes, labels were trimming their rosters. Artists who didn't produce viral moments or club-ready singles were quickly labeled dead weight. R&B wasn't dying, it was being repackaged. Less emotion, more production, easier to market. Neo-soul, once hailed as the thinking person's R&B, was shoved into a niche category almost overnight. When radio stopped playing artists like Amalario, Eric Robertson, and Glenn Lewis, labels lost the incentive to promote them. Neo-soul was suddenly too soft, too mature, not sexy enough. Glenn was boxed into that fading corner. And once executives at Sony began seeing him strictly as that neo-soul guy, he couldn't shake the label's perception, even though his voice was versatile enough to cross genres effortlessly. And what made Glenn Lewis's situation even more tragic was that nobody fought for him. When a new executive team takes over a label, the routine is almost ritualistic. Clean house, prioritize your own roster, and push aside anything that came from the previous regime. Legacy projects, even those that had been critically acclaimed or backed by influential artists, were treated as dead weight. It didn't matter that Jill Scott had called Glenn the next big thing, or that his debut had been celebrated across the industry. If a new executive didn't see him on their agenda, he might as well have been invisible. In the corporate machinery of the music world, Glenn Lewis became a ghost. The album that broke him creatively wasn't due to a lack of effort or talent. It was the system itself. Glenn wasn't ghosted by fans. He was sidelined by the very infrastructure that was supposed to lift him up. There was no rollout, no marketing, no promotion, just silence. Even when he tried to reclaim momentum with the 2003 single Back for More, featuring Canadian rap star Cardinal Offishall, the label stumbled. The album was recorded. It had direction. It was meant to be the next step in his ascent. But it never dropped. And it wasn't just that one album. Glenn went on to record project after project, albums fully formed, ready to release, yet each one sat dormant in a vault, collecting dust as the industry moved on to the next trend. Why? Because Glenn Lewis wasn't loud. He wasn't controversial. He didn't chase gimmicks or viral trends. Long before TikTok or the social media era, he refused to compromise his sound for popularity. He simply wanted to sing. In a market that thrived on spectacle, that made him invisible. He was the quiet threat the industry didn't have the patience or the understanding to nurture. When he finally got another opportunity more than a decade later, it came with strings attached. In 2013, his long-awaited second studio album, Moment of Truth, was released. Fans were hopeful. The press framed it as a comeback. But Glenn himself was clear. It didn't feel like a return. It felt like a compromise. After years of being shelved, tossed aside, and overlooked, he was emotionally exhausted yet still willing to try again. Only this time, he wasn't calling the shots. The album was shaped by too many hands, too many opinions, and too many people attempting to modernize an artist they didn't truly understand. He later admitted in interviews that he had to compromise in ways he shouldn't have. Let that sink in. After over 10 years of creating, waiting, and fighting for space, he was finally allowed to release music again. But not as himself. He was filtered, toned down, diluted. And that, more than anything, is what creative death looks like. The final product, Moment of Truth, wasn't a bad album by any standard, but it didn't reflect who Glenn Lewis truly was, emotionally or musically. After years of being exiled from the industry, he had grown, evolved, and experienced life in ways that shaped his voice and artistry. That growth, however, didn't fully translate to the record. Unlike World Outside My Window, an album that carried Glenn's DNA in every note, every lyric, and every melody, Moment of Truth felt like a compromise. The talent was there. You could hear it. But so too was the tug-of-war between creative freedom and external control. It is undeniably tragic to watch an artist once hailed as the future of soul get reduced to a watered-down version of himself. This wasn't due to a lack of skill or inspiration. It happened because the people in power didn't believe his authentic self was marketable enough. His voice, his sound, his very essence were filtered through layers of label expectations, modernizing tweaks and compromises that diluted what made him unique. This pattern is familiar in the music industry, especially for black artists who don't fit neatly into a commercial mold. If you're not edgy enough to dominate headlines or pop enough to climb the charts, you get boxed in. Your sound is polished until it loses its personality. Your edges are sanded off. Your identity is repackaged, and when the product flops, the blame is shifted to the artist. But Moment of Truth didn't fail because Glenn had lost his touch. It failed because the industry didn't know how to allow him to be himself. Even after all the compromise, the label abandoned him. There was no long-term strategy, no rollout plan for additional singles, no tour budget, just one album and a return to silence. Glenn had been used to tick a box and then discarded. Yet Glenn wasn't finished. What the industry didn't anticipate was that he would eventually find his way back. Not through them, but in spite of them. In the early 2000s, soul still held a seat at the table. Artists like Alicia Keys, Anthony Hamilton, Erykah Badu, and Maxwell weren't just getting radio spins. They were headlining award shows, proving that real vocals, live instruments, and authentic emotion weren't niche. They were necessary. But the industry was changing fast. Suddenly, the charts were dominated by one-dimensional club bangers, auto-tuned vocals, and disposable hooks designed for quick streams rather than lasting impact. The ringtone era had arrived, and with it, labels stopped nurturing art, opting instead to chase algorithms. The space for artists like Glenn, soulful craftsmen, album creators, storytellers, was shrinking. The seismic shift in the music industry didn't just leave Glenn Lewis behind, it erased the entire lane he came from. Neo-soul, once celebrated as the thinking person's R&B, was shoved into a dusty corner labeled too soft, too mature, too real. Even the genre's heavyweights, artists like D'Angelo, disappeared for years as the industry scrambled to chase trends over substance. Labels started to panic. Executives asked themselves, if they can't sell him, how can we sell Glenn Lewis? To the industry, it was never personal. It was business. But to an artist like Glenn, who had poured years of blood, heartbreak, and spiritual growth into his craft, it was devastating. The narrative had shifted. Where once the message had been, "We believe in your voice," it had now become, "Can you make something that sounds like T-Pain?" Glenn was never going to be that guy. He wasn't interested in copying trends. He didn't chase the club scene, nor did he remix his artistry to fit the ephemeral vibe of the moment. He remained steadfast to the same principles that had made his debut album a classic: real lyrics, live instrumentation, and vocals that carried genuine emotion. But the industry didn't want authenticity. It wanted ease, mass appeal, and short-term hits. Instead of adapting to support artists like Glenn, labels took the easier route. They stopped investing. Soul singers, storytellers, musicians who built albums instead of singles became risky. And in a billion-dollar industry, being risky meant being shelved, ignored, and ultimately ghosted. It wasn't just Glenn. This was a wider purge, targeting artists who weren't trendy enough, TikTok club-ready, or easily marketable. This wasn't a dramatic fall from grace, it was a quiet erasure. No press releases, no scandals, just diminished radio play, lower budgets, and fewer opportunities. Eventually, even his most loyal fans were left asking, whatever happened to Glenn Lewis? The irony was cruel. While labels chased ephemeral trends, the audience's appetite for authentic music never disappeared. People still wanted real stories, real instruments, real soul. They just had to dig for it, because the labels had stopped serving it. Glenn was buried beneath the industry's shifting priorities, not because his music changed, but because the system refused to accommodate artists of his caliber. After years of being shelved, ignored, and creatively compromised, Glenn reached a breaking point. He was done. Done with labels, done with politics, done with pretending everything was okay. Watching award shows where he wasn't invited, he withdrew. He stopped singing, stopped listening to music, and even avoided the world that had once celebrated him. When you give the best years of your life to an industry that forgets you the moment you're inconvenient, it breaks something inside you. Glenn wasn't bitter, he was empty. And then DJ Jazzy Jeff called. At the time, Jeff was organizing a retreat, an intimate creative space originally built for DJs and producers. That year, he decided to pivot. He began inviting vocalists, songwriters, and musicians who had something to say but nowhere to express it. He called Glenn personally, and for reasons only Glenn can fully explain, perhaps desperation, perhaps intuition, he said yes. What happened next for Glenn Lewis wasn't just a creative breakthrough, it was a full-fledged resurrection. The retreat organized by DJ Jazzy Jeff became the sanctuary the industry had never given him. For the first time in years, Glenn was in a space where pure, unfiltered creativity could flourish. There were no egos, no branding meetings, no compromises, just music. He was surrounded by artists, producers, and musicians who didn't care about chart positions or algorithms. They cared about vibes, energy, and authenticity. And in that environment, Glenn came alive again. The chemistry between the participants was palpable, the energy electric, and it reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. From that retreat, Jazzy Jeff proposed a bold, audacious idea: record an entire album from scratch in just 7 days. The result was Chasing Goosebumps, a full-length project that featured Glenn Lewis on every track. The album was built live, with a full band and a team of elite musicians creating in real time, as if their lives depended on it. The intensity, spontaneity, and collaboration gave the music a vitality and honesty that had been missing for years. The album didn't receive a mainstream rollout. It didn't climb the Billboard charts. But for those who listened, it was revelatory. Glenn sounded free, focused, and reconnected, his voice and artistry unshackled from corporate constraints. This retreat didn't just revive his sound, it restored his spirit. It reminded him why music had always mattered, not for fame or money, but for the feeling, the emotion, and the storytelling. After years of being sidelined by an industry that didn't understand him, Glenn finally rediscovered control over his own art. He wasn't chasing a label deal anymore, nor waiting for approval. He was building his future from the ground up, working with real collaborators and pursuing real purpose. No filters, no compromises. Glenn Lewis didn't need a comeback. What he needed was a creative sanctuary, and DJ Jazzy Jeff had given him one. Since that rebirth, Glenn hasn't rushed into releasing another mainstream album. In 2019, he posted a simple studio photo on Instagram with the caption, "Studio Vibes." "I'm coming with something new soon." No flashy announcements, no orchestrated rollout, just quiet confidence. The post resonated immediately, fans from every corner of the internet reaching out to show they had never stopped waiting for him. Even now, there are no official singles, no major album releases, just silence. But this silence is intentional. Glenn Lewis is no longer seeking validation from an industry that once discarded him. He makes music on his own terms, in his own time, with his people. And perhaps that is the real victory. Today, Glenn is a husband, a father, and a man who survived an industry that chewed him up and spat him out, and emerged more grounded, not embittered. He never had a public meltdown, never attacked anyone on social media, and never threw colleagues under the bus. Instead, he chose the long road, the quiet fight, the type of resilience that doesn't trend on Twitter but builds a lasting legacy. Glenn Lewis didn't disappear because he failed. He disappeared because the music industry didn't value the type of success he represented. Yet, he remains. Respected, gifted, quietly legendary. The next time someone asks, "Whatever happened to Glenn Lewis?" the answer is simple. He didn't fall off. He just stopped waiting for the industry to catch up. And when he decides to release again, it won't be a comeback. It will be him, finally, on his own terms. Glenn Lewis's story is a powerful reminder of how talent alone isn't always enough in an industry driven by trends, politics, and fleeting attention. From rising as the next Stevie Wonder to being sidelined, creatively compromised, and then finally rediscovering his artistry on his own terms, his journey is both tragic and inspiring. What do you think was the most defining moment in Glenn Lewis's career? His initial rise, the decade of silence, or his creative resurrection with DJ Jazzy Jeff? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into forgotten stories like the forgotten tragedy of Glenn Lewis, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content uncovering the hidden truths behind music's most overlooked legends.